next guest will be Łukasz Burdka from Techland, and he will tell us about players' physics for natural movement.
Hey everyone, my name is Łukasz Burdka, and I'm a technology programmer at Techland. I specialize in programming physics, inverse kinematics, and procedural generation. I've been working at Techland for 3 years, and I took part in the development of Dying Light the Following, and 2 new titles that I would love to tell you about. But the marketing guys would probably kill me. So today, I would like to share my experience in programming players' physics for games featuring natural movement. First, I'll tell you how we handled this subject in Dying Light. Then I'm going to reveal the problems that we faced. And finally, I would like to tell you how we decided to solve these problems by trying a completely new approach to players' physics. Okay, so I guess all of you know what a player is and what physics is. But how do they go together? When I say a player, I really mean the in-game character controlled by a human player. And when I say physics, I mean all the code responsible for dynamic movement of objects without overlapping each other. Maybe you've heard about Havoc, maybe you've heard about physics or Bullet. These are physics engines that deal with dynamics of movement and collision detection. So can't we just take one of these engines and use them just like that? In some cases, probably yes. Then why do we need physics programmers in Techland to do anything for our games? How many of you have played Dying Light? Quite a lot of people. That's cool. So the thing is, our player is a tracer. He uses parkour all the time. He can go anywhere and climb everything. And that's what we call natural movement. And that's one reason why in our case, physics subjects demand special amount of attention. Furthermore, the player is not a chair. He's not a single rigid object. He's far more complex than that. He can run, he can climb, he jumps, dodges, slides, vaults over enemies, kicks them in the face. Lots of shit, really. What makes things even more challenging is the fact that we can't really predict our player's movement trajectory or actions because he's controlled by a real human, and we don't know too much about our gamers' intentions. But we know something about their expectations. So the player needs to traverse the environment fluently and naturally. Dying Light is an FPP game, so the natural feeling of movement is essential to the immersion. Not only he needs to move correctly, it's super important for us that he does it with style. Are there any gameplay programmers in this room, maybe? Okay, so what I'm talking about partially is the responsibility of the gameplay code, but not only. So what's the physics role in this show? Physics makes the player an integral part of the environment. It makes sure he doesn't penetrate walls, doesn't fall through the floor, or falls through it when it's our game's intention. So why am I even telling you about players' physics today? Turns out it's not obvious how it should be done. We knew about three approaches to this subject. The classical one is to simulate physics using physics engines and try to force the engine to run the simulation the way we want it to be executed. And we achieve it by using rigid bodies, constraints, and forces. On the other hand, we can fake physics and make the player sim physical without using physics engines, without the simulation. In this case, the gameplay code is responsible for everything, from movement mechanics to determining where the player can or can't go. Usually the movement area is restricted, for example, by a nav mesh, and such an approach is used in some MMOs. And finally, we can go for a hybrid approach and use the physics engine only for stuff like collision detection, sweep tests, or ray tests, but have all the movement mechanics implemented at the gameplay side. In Dying Light, we decided to go for the first classical approach. Now, why? Is it absolutely the best? Is it least problematic? Does it produce the best results? Well, truth be told, there were reasons, but they were rather more pragmatic. So the most important reason was we'd already had this piece of technology. It was used in our previous games, it was tested and trustworthy. All we had to do was just adapt it to natural movement. Piece of cake, huh? Well, no, not by a long shot. And another good reason was our AIs used it. And we thought it's a good idea to reuse the same code where we can, instead of having two separate but similar systems that we have to support. And worth mentioning, our physics team was rather small at the time and didn't have much power for a revolution in the code. By the way, how many people do you think are responsible for physics in a big AAA studio like Techland? Give it a shot. My guess was 5. So, the truth is, at the beginning of development of Dying Light, the whole physics was coded by one person. And by the way, this guy was the only one responsible for coding physics all by himself for over 10 years. And he was the only one responsible for navmesh and pathfinding as well. Techland's games wouldn't be the same without him. Give a loud shout out to Zahar. Yeah, believe me, this man deserves serious respect. I joined him mid-project, when the decision about physics configuration was already made. Now I'll tell you how we've done it, what worked well, and what problems we faced. So as I already told you, we decided to use a physically simulated dynamic controller in Dying Light. Our body weighted 80 kilograms. For the collider, we used 1.8 meters tall and 0.8 meters wide ellipsoid, which is a sphere scaled along the vertical y-axis. To make sure that the body doesn't fall to the side, it was constrained to be always aligned with the vertical axis. And additionally, we ignored all the angular external forces to make sure that the orientation is always correct, straight up. The gameplay code would move the player by setting wanted linear velocity on the XZ plane. And we moved the player by trying to match this velocity using forces. Jumps were executing as impulses, so vertical forces applied to the body. And we detected if the player is on the ground or not, based on the collision information from the engine. If the player was on the ground, he had full control over the movement, while in air, the control was reduced. It's a clean and simple concept, and it works well for a number of reasons. Thanks to the gravity, stuff like jumping or falling from the roof work out of the box and feel quite natural. If you can't climb a hill while walking, just try running. If you can do it running, then it's too steep. No special handling needed. The kickback after an explosion or concrete block toss work like just for any other dynamic bodies, by applying forces to the player. And collision detection worked just like for a chair or for a ball, and was enforced by the constraint solver in the physics engine. So these advantages mostly come down to one, that we can treat the player similarly to other dynamic bodies in our game. And we were able to easily achieve decent results this way. But just decent was not what we aimed for. And hell, there were problems. So remember when I told you that the player is not a chair? It's important to keep that in mind, because the advantages I just told you about turned against us at some point. Because stuff like collision detection, consequences of gravity, or moving around using forces can make things hard for the player. Discrete collision detection has its flaws, you see. The first one is what I call a bumpy surface nightmare. And it goes like that. On a triangle mesh that forms a perfectly flat floor, the movement should be perfectly smooth, and all contact normals should be perfectly vertical. But we're not living in a perfect world. And that's not the case. Because there are triangles there, and sometimes we collide with triangle edge or vertex, and the contact normal gets distorted, which leads to two problems. First, the player is slightly slowed down, but worse, he's launched into the air above the surface. And it can be problematic if we detect the fact if he's on the ground or not this way. Another problem is if we push against the corner of walls, especially if these walls are not perfectly vertical. We just bounce from one wall to another if the angle is wide enough. And it causes the camera to shake instead of just making players stand still in the corner. So we managed to solve these problems by treating all almost vertical walls as exactly vertical and just making the contact normals parallel to the ground. And the tolerance was about 15 degrees, so quite significant. As for the bumpy surface nightmare, we just rejected all edge and vertex normals that were in the bottom part of the ellipsoid. And it did the trick mostly. Now, controlling the movement using forces makes it hard to predict where the player will be at some given time. So let's say we want to reach a balcony floor that's 1 meter away in exactly 0.3 seconds. And we need to be this precise because we want our cool parkour animation to hit the barrier perfectly. So the maths for calculating it seem quite simple. But what about the friction? What if we collide some trash that lies on the ground? What if the floor is not perfectly flat? It makes this calculation harder or even impossible to predict in advance. So we managed to reduce this problem by setting the friction to 0. And also, we had to multiply all our forces by some magic factor that we set experimentally by trial and error method. And we don't know exactly where it came from, but yeah, honestly, it was partially caused by the bumpy surface nightmare, partially by some synchronization issues, but we're not sure up to this day. And then there is gravity. Gravity is a bitch, you know. It makes seem helpful at the first glimpse, but just try to make the player stand still on a slope roof, or not fall from an edge if he's too close to it. Especially if for some reason you just set the friction to 0. So we had to set the friction to some maximum value when the player was standing still, and when he intended to move, we set the friction to 0. And it would work quite nicely. Another roof-related problem that we were not able to fix was traversing the rooftop. Because when the player is moving fast, he has some vertical speed, and he detaches from the roof surface at the peak. And we detect that he's in the air, and we lose control over the movement, which is a bit frustrating. But even more interesting was the problem with jumping from the edge of the roof. Because, you know, Dying Light is an FPP game, and the player was running fast, and he was looking straight ahead. So he didn't know where exactly the edge is. And gamers really got frustrated because they would hit the jump button too late and would fall to their doom. So we had to allow jumping for a short period after the player detaches from the roof. And as you see from the TPP mode, it was actually quite a large distance, but it wasn't visible in the FPP mode. It felt quite natural, and it made gamers happy. And speaking of gravity and jumping, did you know that we had to multiply the gravity ×2 for the player to make it seem natural? Well, it's because humans jump really low in real life, and our player jumped quite high. And this made falling down feel like a slow motion. So for human to feel comfortable and like in real life, we had to multiply it ×2. You didn't know about it, did you? Another consequence of gravity. Because we're using moving forces, the fact if an obstacle is possible or impossible to climb depends on how fast we move. And okay, it might seem reasonable, but just imagine the dread when we discovered that the player can easily climb a curb on the street when moving at fixed speed using keyboard, but he can't do the same thing while moving slowly on a gamepad analog. And it led to birth of the complex auto-step system, which allowed for climbing low obstacles no matter how slowly we move. And it was one of many complex systems dedicated to some specific issues that we had to implement. And I could go like that for quite a long time. My point is, we managed to solve most of these problems, because programming is mostly about solving problems, right? We also had to live with a few problems I mentioned we were not able to solve, and sometimes we just had to switch off physics completely for a couple of seconds to play some animation or do some climbing or stuff like that, when we didn't know how to get this right using physics. And we succeeded, in fact, because Dying Light sold really well and it was a great game. But you should have seen the code. The number of hacks and workarounds that we had to implement to make it work were just huge. And the greatest advantage of using this approach, so being simple and working out of the box, was gone when we had to tailor it to suit our needs perfectly. So, Dying Light was already shipped, and we had some time for technology development. And for the number of reasons, we were swapping our physics engine at the time. You need to understand that the size of our physics team doubled when I joined, so we felt that we can achieve everything. I wonder if any of you have heard about our old physics engine. It was ODE, Open Dynamics Engine. Anyone knows it? Yeah, okay. That's not a popular one, and it wasn't supported and developed for a long time. So we decided to switch to Bullet, which is also open source, but it's still actively developed. And we had two choices. We could either rewrite our complicated dynamic physics to Bullet, or we could use our new shiny engine and its features to try something completely new. And for me, the choice was obvious. Soon, all of our problems were about to be gone forever. I wasn't very experienced at the time, you know. So let me tell you about our new design. We wanted to get rid of all the problems that made our life hard before. So we didn't want to rely on discrete collision detection that much. We wanted to control the movement precisely, not using forces and velocities, but just by setting the displacement. And we wanted to have full control over the gravity, finally, and have full control over how our player sticks to the environment he traverses. And so, the sweep test-based kinematic character controller was born. And as the name suggests, it was quite simple. We just set the target position where we wanted to move. And using volumetric traces, aka sweep tests, we checked how far we can move in that direction. Then, using sweep tests, we checked where the ground is. And finally, we moved a kinematic body there. Then, now for those of you who are not familiar with these terms, a kinematic body is a physical body that is moved around by setting its position. And no forces affect kinematic body. But it can push other dynamic objects around. It's just immovable by other dynamic objects, like a fast, unstoppable train. And sweep tests are just like ray tests. Only instead of having a point and casting it along a line segment to check where it stops, we cast a convex shape along a line segment and check where it stops. So this time our player had no mass, because kinematic bodies by design don't have a mass. And we used capsule this time, not an ellipsoid, which has a sphere in the half and top part, which makes some calculations really convenient. It was a kinematic body, so it was completely force-proof. And we used sweep tests to detect where we can move. And the algorithm of movement worked like that. We have some position where the player stands, and we want to move to a target position. So we need to know the maximum obstacle height that we can step on. We cast the sphere vertically above the maximum obstacle height and check where we can move in that direction. Then we cast the sphere down to check where the ground is, or if there even is a ground at all. Then we cast the sphere up to check if there is enough place to stand there, or if we should crouch, or if there is not enough space. And it forms a capsule. And we normally move a kinematic body there. But if we detect that we can't move there because it's too steep or too high or whatever, we can perform additional validation step by just casting the capsule from target to from source to target destination and check where it stops, and then rerun the algorithm trying to reach this new destination. And the general idea is not very complex, and the implementation was rather simple. But as always, the devil is in the detail. So the first important problem were wall slides. And the problem was they wasn't there. Because if sweep tests detect that there's a wall on the way, it just stops. It doesn't matter how great the angle is. You just stopped on the wall. And in in dynamic controller, it worked out of the box, just like that. We had sliding for free. But here we had to implement it on our own by finding a new reflected position and trying to move there. And sometimes there was a corner or another wall, or the wall wasn't perfectly flat, and it was just madness. And trying to balance it so that the player doesn't get stuck on the wall and doesn't just bounce here and there on the wall made me understand that constraint solvers exist for a good reason in physics engines. Sliding down. So when we cast a sphere down and we detect that we can move in that place, we just stand there. And I was really proud of this solution, because in dynamic physics we had a lot of problems that we would fall from some obstacles or fall from roofs or fall down all the time. Here we had no falling down. But one day, one of our gameplay programmers came to me and said, "You know, there's a bug in your code. When I stand on the end of the edge, I don't slide down." And I said, "Hey, that's not a bug. That's how you wanted it to work. No more sliding down when you don't want it. No more unpredicted movement. Full control over the player and stuff, right?" And he showed me this screenshot. And he said, "We wanted it to look like that. Look at this shit, man. He has both feet in the air and he's still standing there. It can't work like that." And, well, it's hard to argue. So we had to implement sliding down on our own, and sliding down on steep slopes as well. And this was especially tricky, because when stepping on some obstacle, we didn't want the player to slow down at all, or we didn't want him to move a bit back when we were trying to step on some obstacle. So this sliding down was meant to work only when the player was not trying to climb something, or he was moving into the edge direction, and sliding was okay. Which led to the narrow shelf horror. And it goes like that. If you face a wall and want to climb on a shelf, but it's too narrow to stand there, and you would slide down either way. Because we have sliding, it would work like that. You make a step up and slide down, up, down, and just bounce like that. And it sucks, really. So, the gameplay guys wanted it to work like that, that we really shouldn't be allowed to make a climb on such a narrow shelf at all. And it was really problematic because it was a special case, and I had to detect somehow how deep the shelf is. And it just took me a very long time to get it right. Finally, what we did was try to test it using a small capsule and just detect if there's enough space to stand there every time we tried to make a step above the place where we stood. And it worked quite well, but you can imagine that the number of ifs in the code was dangerously growing, and it was meant to be a simple design. And then, one day, the forces decided to strike back. Because, as I've told you, no forces affect a kinematic body. And it's really cool, because no AIs can push our player around, and he feels really steady. But we don't want him to feel steady if a train hits him. So the forces had to be implemented manually at the gameplay side, just by setting a displacement to our player when something heavy hits him that should move the player. Also, our player didn't apply forces to other dynamic objects. And, the kinematic body can easily do that, but we were using sweep tests to detect where we can go. And the chair was just as good and as immovable obstacle as a concrete wall. So I told the gameplay guys, if you want to push a chair, you probably need to play some animation of pushing it, so you can as well just apply forces on your own, right? And yeah, it was a good workaround until we wanted to push some small trash that was lying on the ground that didn't really require any animation to be played. We just wanted to be pushed around as we walk. So in these cases, we had to allow marking such objects as allowed to be penetrated by sweep tests. And then we just moved the kinematic body so it overlaps with these objects, and they got pushed around. Obviously, it made sense only to mark dynamic objects this way, because if we would mark a wall like that, the player would go through the wall. And I spent really countless hours on this map trying to invent all possible geometry and any case I could figure out. But the level artists were always able to surprise me with something new and creative that I didn't think of. And there were so many times when I thought how our life was easier when we used the dynamic physics. And I had so many doubts if it's the right direction. But after fixing all these problems one by one and just looking at the final result, I think it was worth it. So what's the moral of this story? Obviously, you can all draw your own conclusions. Here's what I learned from it. There's no silver bullet. The one perfect solution for players' physics doesn't exist. And it doesn't matter if you use Havoc, physics, or bullet. You have to analyze the needs of your game and just figure out what suits you most, what resources do you have, and then decide which physics configuration will be the best for you. The dynamic physics lets you achieve good results relatively fast and leaves a lot in the hand of the physics engine. But I believe it has its limitations. While the kinematic controller takes really a lot of time to get it right, and a lot of coding, a lot of nerves, but I believe it is suited more to full control, and it's not just restricted by the physics engine. And if you expect your physics for the player to be robust and make it allow just moving in the unconstrained open world, don't make my mistake and don't assume it can be simple. Because players' physics for the open world and for an FPP game is really a sophisticated problem. And it's better to plan in advance, keeping that in mind. Sooner or later, it will get complex. And after dealing with both of these approaches, which one do I think suits natural movement better? So, natural movement is all about full control and freedom of movement. So I believe that the kinematic sweep test-based approach is better here. But you will be able to test it on your own because it's successfully used in the games we're working at right now. And soon you'll just be able to check it in our 2 upcoming games that I totally can't tell you about. Thank you for your attention. I believe we still have some time for questions.
Check, check. Okay, so since you ended up having a kinematic body that processes the forces manually and applies forces manually to other objects in the world, so that is, then have you looked at other games that had the sweep test controller already implemented? Because it's like, it's something that, for instance, Quake and Unreal had in the 90s, and there are many games that have their source code already available. And with a more recent example, you also have this kind of controller in Unreal Engine 4. So I would say that there are really many examples of how this is done. I would consider this a solved problem. And did you, use maybe that as a reference in some way?
Yes, we did. But actually, it wasn't my responsibility very much because we just left it at the gameplay side. But we analyzed these examples, and there are various approaches to how it can be done. For example, the kinematic body can be a bit bigger than the sweep test, so that we always penetrate the body a little bit and apply some forces are applied by the engine. But the problem is how much of these forces should be applied and how strong the player should push other objects. That's something that if we want to have a control over, we decided it's best for us if we do it just manually by calculating the required force.
Yeah, but I sort of meant like the problems that you had with the narrow shelf and like with slipping of the slopes and sliding of the walls. I work with that code and in Unreal, for instance, and it's just been solved.
Yeah, sure. So the movement controller in Unreal Engine has 10,000 lines of code, and it's not a simple design, and it really relies on a lot of systems that Unreal has. And it's really not something that works just like that. And we tried to keep it simple. It was our intention. Well, we ended up failing this requirement, but we still have about 2,000 lines of code in the physics controller, so it's relatively more simple than in Unreal case.
Hi, did you use the same thing for the enemies or something simpler, different?
It's not decided finally. Right now, AIs use some simplified version of the dynamic controller that was used for the player in Dying Light. Because I think they will finally decide that the one we use for the player is better. But right now, they are just using the old one because they didn't want to adapt the AI code to the new approach very much.
Any more questions?
when I was listening to you, I couldn't help the feeling that you're talking about natural movement, but you actually don't mean natural movement. You mean the movement that feels good, but it's everything but natural. Because, for example, if a character is falling and you have to double its gravity, it feels good, but it's everything but natural. So, don't you think that the first problem you were trying to solve was actually unsolvable, and that's why you had to look for another approach?
Yes, probably. By saying natural, I really mean exactly as you said, the one that feels natural. It doesn't have to be implemented correctly with the physics, because, you know, video games are all about faking stuff to make it look natural and look realistic. So the same things goes for the movement. It just needed to give the feeling that is familiar to people. Like, for example, with the falling.
Right. And one more question: uh, did you did you have any problems because you were talking about applying force to make sure that the movement of character matches the animation? Any specific advices on basically tangling the physics with animations without actually tangling them, without intertwining to both systems, just making it look good?
No, it's one of the most difficult problems. And it's easiest to solve it just by using the kinematic approach and setting the displacement, because then you know exactly how much you move. And if you use forces and velocities, you can't really be sure, especially on a terrain that is not flat, on some hills or stuff like that. It's just really hard to calculate and predict it. So no, we didn't solve it eventually in the case of dynamic controller. When we wanted to have animations really look super good without sliding on the ground or stuff like that, we just decided that it will be best solved with the kinematic approach.
I have two questions. First, so how did you handle gravity in your approach? Did you just check if the player is in the air, and did you forget about the slopes and stuff like that? And the second question is, if you had to pick one biggest challenge in writing your own approach, what would it be?
Okay, so about the gravity, yeah, when we cast the sphere down, and obviously we cast it a bit below the level where the player is to make him stick well to the environment. But if it doesn't hit anything, then we detect that he's in the air. Or when he jumps, we detect that he's in the air as well. And then we just calculate the gravity on our own. Because, you know, calculating the gravity is not big rocket science. So we just did it in our physics controller, and we had it was specially treated there. And for the slopes, we actually didn't slide down quite physically. It depended on the surface we were sliding down. So the speed that's allowed to slide on the surface depended on the type of the surface, so the material that's used there. And the biggest challenge, in fact, the biggest challenge was definitely the narrow shelf problem. It took just eternity to get it right. Probably because I fixed myself that testing how deep the shelf is should be done by the sweep tests. And it was problematic because as long as the player was more or less facing the wall or facing the shelf, casting the sphere further was quite good to detect how deep it is. But if he was using almost parallel to the shelf, then the sweep test just said that the shelf is really deep. And we tried to step on it and up and down, and yeah, it was really awful. And also because it's not really clear how it should be done, because, for example, if you're falling and down and you touch the wall, and suddenly you reach a narrow shelf while falling down, you should slide down, right? But you shouldn't even be able to stand there in the first place. So another ifs and ifs and ifs. It was really hard to do it in some general approach without just adding ifs as the new geometry appears.
Anyone else? No? Okay, so give one more.
So another question: do you support standing or being attached to moving objects?
Yeah, I didn't mention it, yeah, but it was as problematic in dynamic controller as it is in kinematic one. In both cases, we just have to detect that we're touching a moving platform, and we can only be attached to one platform, and we just update the position manually based on the position of the platform. But yeah, it's hard. But we don't have too many moving platforms. Maybe you noticed in Dying Light.
Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, or do we have? No? Okay, so give a great applause again to Łukasz.